I'm Anton, and I'm a climatologist, and chances are you might be too. Climatologists sit at the intersection of business and nature. They want to play a key role in minimising the human-led impact on the environment, but they also understand the realities of living and working in a modern, capitalist world. Most importantly, they understand the central role that businesses can play in tackling the climate crisis. Ultimately, a climatologist believes that the future of profitable, good business can be equally profitable for the environment, but we've got a way to go before we get there. So if you too have pondered how we get to a future where clean, regenerative policy is embedded with profitable business models, the climatologist movement may just be for you. In this series, I'll be proving that climatologists are already out there leading the charge to marry their own good businesses with sustainable climate principles.
Today I'm interviewing Mithra Cox. She's a Greens councillor in the city of Wollongong. Mithra has had a front row seat on the challenges of pushing for change, even when it makes people uncomfortable. In her time as a councillor, she has learned the art of negotiation and compromise, and importantly, knowing when to stick to your guns.
Stay with us, and if you like the episode, please subscribe and follow Climatologist on all socials. Enjoy.
So let's set the scene for a minute. Wollongong is a beautiful coastal town 2 hours south of Sydney. Mithra, how would you describe Wollongong to people who have never heard of it before?
Yeah, look, the reputation of Wollongong is a city that is built on fossil fuels and heavy industry. Those are probably the two things that people think of when you think of Wollongong. We have a steelworks, one of the two remaining steelworks in Australia. And the reason we've got that steelworks is because we've got hills filled with coal behind us. And when you talk to people in Wollongong, if they didn't work in the mines or the steelworks, their dad did, their uncle did, their grandfather did. And that is really, Wollongong has been built on that heavy industry. And so, when you're thinking about energy transition and climate change, you think, wow, that's going to be one of the harder places to do that, actually.
That's incredible. So on that, you identify as a green, and that necessarily involves a deep connection to nature and the environment. Can you tell us how you reconcile that with this industrial heartland that you're in?
Yeah, the industrial heartland of Wollongong is something that I think rightly everyone is really proud of in Wollongong, and it's sort of baked into our identity, and it's also baked into our politics. It's one of the places where it's had a really long history of trade unionism, and that provided for working class people a political education and a way of understanding the world in terms of who has power, why do they have it, how do they have it, and how do ordinary working people have power. And I think the trade unions in Wollongong have really impacted the way that politics in this city works. And they've, over many, many years shown leadership on a range of different issues from, the peace movement all the way back in the Second World War when the Dalfram dispute happened. That was a really famous dispute that happened here in Wollongong where dock workers refused to load pig iron onto ships to send to Japan because there was fear that that pig iron was going to be used as weapons in a war against China, but around the Second World War. And those workers refused to do that. They were on strike for weeks and weeks and weeks. They had no pay. They were supported by both the local community and also Chinese market gardeners who provided food for those families so they could afford to strike for that amount of time. But, also women's movement, peace movement have all been supported by trade unions in this city. And I think that's a really important part of the story is that through that collective organising, people have had an understanding of politics and power. And while, the fossil fuel industry is absolutely a part of our history, it's not a part of our history that we need to be ashamed of. Digging up and burning coal in the 1800s or the 1930s is not the same as doing it now when we know the damage that it's causing and we have alternative technologies. And so I think there's not a disconnect there. It's okay to be proud of an industrial past and also move towards an energy transition where we get energy from different sources. Both of those things can coexist quite happily.
And is that what inspired you to get into politics and run for councillor?
Absolutely. I think my identity as being a Greens councillor is not just about that deep green stuff, about environmentalism. It's also about collective action and about communities doing things together, because structural change and creating big changes and lasting changes is about collective action, and it's about doing things together. And the way that you do that is through politics. And so I see those things as being absolutely interconnected. Grassroots movements and politics need each other. You can't get political change without the community being on board and being supportive. And you also need politicians with a seat at the decision table who are willing to, take some risks to create that change. And both of those things are really important.
I imagine with that union background and what you're describing as a politicized community, the role of a politician is a little bit tougher maybe than in other communities. Is that fair to say?
Oh, look, yes and no. I feel like I would always rather have an engaged community that's willing to have complex conversations than an unengaged community that doesn't care. And I've always felt that in politics, I've been involved in politics for a really long time. Actually, as a teenager, before I was even able to vote, I used to stand on polling booths with my dad and hand out how to vote cards. And I could never understand those adults that would sort of walk past angrily and say, oh, politics is all the same, you're all bloody same. And I thought, wow, I wish I could vote. I wish I had that opportunity. And that's what it means to live in a democracy. And I can't understand the people that don't value that. And honestly, what's the alternative to live in a dictatorship? And I actually have more respect for people that have a strong opinion that is different to mine, but they're there because they have a strong opinion and they genuinely think that they're making the world a better place. And with those people, I feel like you can always have a conversation because they care, they're engaged, they're open to it. And, difficult debates are the more interesting ones, I would say. Whereas it's much more difficult to,
There's a lot of perspective taking there.
Absolutely. And, genuine debate is how you get to better outcomes, actually. None of us know all of the answers, and it's only by interrogating our own positions and interrogating each other's that you kind of find the flaws and find the strengths and come up with better solutions. And so, having difficult conversations with people that care, I think, is something that is really important to democracy and really worth doing.
Wow. Sounds like you're channeling Socrates there. So that the political way, we have to fight, and in the fire of conflict is when we get to the truth. Absolutely.
Maybe not even the truth, but maybe a compromise that everybody can live with. But I think also coming with that sense of it's not just up to me to change your mind, but it's also up to me to be open for you to change mine, and to actually come to a conversation in the spirit of trying to listen, trying to understand each other. There's some things that for me are not negotiable, and that's sort of like your ground values, like your essential values of what you believe is right and wrong. And for me, those things are immovable. That the idea that everybody should be equal, everybody should be treated with respect, those sorts of things. Everybody deserves to have a good future. Everybody deserves to have a decent place to live. Those sort of things for me are kind of not negotiable essential values. But how we get there and how we do that best, those things I think are absolutely up for debate. And that's where, it's not easy, and it's better to talk to people.
And on that question of debate, so you do identify as a Green. So we sort of come back to that question, which is why that position? So why do you take that perspective? And what does that perspective mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the Greens have a really clear set of values that are my values. It's grassroots democracy, it's peace and non-violence, it's ecological sustainability, and it's social justice. And those are the sort of the four pillars that drive what we do, what our motivations are, what we're trying to achieve in the world. Other political parties have quite different values, and that sort of guides what they're doing. But for me, those things are really important, and those are things that I really want to see in the world. But, there are times, of course, when those values brush up against each other. And, like we're in a housing crisis. We need to build housing. but everything has an impact. And so, clearing parkland or forest to build housing, you've got an obvious clash of those values of ecological sustainability versus social justice and human rights. And so how you best balance that for everybody, that, those things are complicated.
And there's no issue more complicated, I think, than the sustainable climate, wind farms. We're going to get to a lot of that stuff, I think, over the course of the conversation today. So changing tack slightly, before becoming a councillor, you were a political media officer in New South Wales State Parliament. How did that role prepare you? What were the biggest adjustments you had to make moving from the back office to the front office?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I've learnt in my time in politics is that everything is about power and who has it. Negotiations are genuine when power is not concentrated. And so I've been really lucky on Wollongong Council that no one block has a majority. And so negotiation is really key. When I was working in the state parliament, that was not the case, and there was a majority government, and the debates on the floor of parliament were not genuine debates. There was nothing up for debate. It was already decided before that legislation had been introduced. And I think, there's a lot of governments would like you to believe that minority governments are unstable, but I absolutely disagree with that. I think minority governments are places where debate is genuine, and policies do need to be fought out and compromises need to be found. And I think compromise is a really important part of democracy, and it's a really important part of kind of keeping the middle ground and not radicalising down one path or another. And, I think we saw, when in the Abbott era, when they had an absolute majority, how quickly things can radicalise and how quickly the middle can be forgotten because there is no need to compromise. And so I think that is one of the really key things that I learned, is that, the way the numbers fall actually makes a really big difference to how well that decision-making forum functions. And, how much political capital you bring is based on how much power you have in that negotiation.
Taking an absolutist view, a majority government gives you the capacity to take an absolutist view. I was at a festival recently and I saw Jane Fonda speak in a really fiery way, like a preacher at the pulpit, about climate change, and in particular hammering the oil and gas companies and the fossil fuel industry for being evil and doing all the wrong things. What do you think that approach does to businesses that are maybe trying to do the right thing or thinking about they're trying to do the right thing? Where does that push them?
Yeah, it depends on who that audience is and what your intention is, doesn't it? Because if your intention is to convince people who disagree with you to change their view, it's not going to work. If your intention is to fire up people who already agree with you to take action, maybe it does. And so I think the question of who the audience is and what the intention is important there. The question of climate change has been really polarizing, but I think it's been less polarizing because of what individuals think. There has actually been a consensus amongst ordinary people in Australia for a really long time, since about 2008. Polling has been incredibly consistent that, 70, 80, 90% of people think it's important and think we need to do something. The difficulty is that it has been used as a political game to try to divide people. And that has made it a really intractably difficult problem to solve, because people identify with groups. People love to identify with groups. And so if you hear a politician who you identify with as the group that you belong to kind of saying absurd things about climate change, people feel loyal and they feel like they need to stick with that group. And so, that polarizing language actually serves to divide people. Whereas in reality, most people are actually seeing the impacts. They see that it's serious. They want people to take it seriously. They want solutions. And so, I feel like we're much better served by having a debate about how best to solve it, rather than trying to make people on the other side feel silly or stupid or not relevant or not of value, because that only serves to divide people and doesn't serve to kind of find solutions, and create the political consensus that's needed.
It's really fascinating to talk to you. I haven't had a lot to do with the Green Party. I voted Green in the past, primarily because I'm gay, and the Green Party was incredibly supportive of gay people, of LGBT, and all the acronyms people, in being able to get married. That was a really important issue for me. And climate is also a really important issue for me. It's something that I resonate with. So I'm excited to be talking to you. I hadn't realized that the Greens were so pragmatic. Or is the way that you're approaching this problem similar to the way that the Greens would approach this problem of climate change and engagement and political discourse?
It's a good question. I think, look, it's a big and diverse party, and I think to a certain extent it really depends on the position that you're in, because if you're in a position of decision making where the numbers are not settled, like I have been, you absolutely have the capacity to negotiate and get outcomes. And I've actually really been surprised at how many outcomes we've been able to get over the last 7 years because of that. Not everyone's in that position. So a lot of Greens representatives are sitting in councils or in the state parliament, for example, where there is no genuine negotiation. And so your role in that situation is quite different, because pragmatism gets you nowhere if you don't have the numbers and you don't actually have a seat at the decision table to negotiate. And so I think that does actually vary a lot depending on where people are and how those numbers fall.
So whether the people in power are willing to bring you into the tent or whether they have to do it because everyone's in power.
In my experience, it's very, very infrequently about how willing they are and more about whether they have to, because that's the way the numbers fall.
So let's drill into a specific example. Wollongong's climate mitigation strategy. Tell us about the strategy. What is it, and what was your role in using consensus and other everything probably in the toolbox to make it come about?
Look, it is one of the things that I am most proud of in my time there. Before I was on council, there was absolutely no climate plans on Wollongong City Council, and if you go back and listen to debates from the council at that time, the most absurd things were being said about climate change being caused by solar flares, it being a conspiracy, all of those old tropes that we've all heard time and time again. But after we were elected, we worked really hard with the Labor councillors who were also really concerned about climate change, which was not all of them, but it was some of them. And we worked on a solution that meant that one of the Labor councillors would introduce first a motion to declare a climate emergency, which we would second. And the fact that they were able to be front and centre of that and not us enabled us to build the consensus to get the 7 votes that we needed to get that across council. So, really important to allow everybody to own it equally and for it not to try and be, we beat the Labor Party at this, like we actually worked together to try and get it through. It was the only way it was going to get through. After we declared the climate emergency, that was actually a consensus vote on council, which was pretty extraordinary considering the history of the place. And again, a lot of that was about not belittling people, not criticising the industrial past of the city, acknowledging that, actually celebrating that, trying to bring those people with us. The next step was then to look at how the rubber hits the road in terms of actual strategies and actions on council. So, a climate emergency is a symbolic statement, but it points you in a certain direction. And council loves to have things that are consistent. So if you've got one statement that has a principled position, it's so much easier to get a strategy that points in that same direction. So the next step was a climate mitigation strategy. So that was about reducing council's own emissions and operationally. So that's, things that council has control of, the tip, the car fleet, the street lights, cutting emissions in those areas, but also setting a target for the entire city to cut emissions. And initially that was a 2050 target to get to net zero. But our community felt that it was not enough. And they came and they rallied outside council. And I still remember that meeting There were drums outside. The public gallery was so packed they had to put up a live screen in the libraries for the overflow because there wasn't enough seats in the council chamber. It was quite extraordinary. It was the biggest public gallery I've ever seen at a council meeting, and that pressure meant that we were able to move that target forward to 2030. And so, that's a really significant difference. That's a 20-year difference in what our targets were. And again, that was a consensus decision of the council because the councillors could see how important this was to the community and how many people there were that cared about it. And then the next part of that is that you can see that commitment filtering down to actual actions. And so that means we've implemented FOGO, which is food organics collection that goes into the green bin, because council's biggest source of emissions is the tip, actually. It's 80% of council's emissions. And so taking the food waste out of the tip and composting that is actually probably the single biggest contribution to reducing our emissions.
I've been trying to work out how to compost for the last 3 or 4 months. I've just become a property owner in the Gold Coast region, and I have no idea how to compost. I'm in an apartment, 12-unit block. Everyone's too busy. Don't want to deal with the smells and the sounds and all the other things that come out of it. And you're composting.
Yeah, absolutely. And at a systemic scale, right? It's not about asking individual people in an apartment to get a worm farm. It's actually citywide at scale. So every single household gets a little bitty bin. That food waste goes into the green bin, which gets collected every week, exactly the same as the red bin does. There's really no change from the point of view of the person except for which coloured bin they put that waste into. But it means that we are saving 3 million tonnes of food waste. That's what I mean about creating change that is systemic rather than individual changes, which, you feel like you're doing something, but you also know that it's never going to solve those big problems.
One of my other earlier guests, talked about the role of business being to empower people to make good choices instead of forcing them to have to muddle their way around. And that's a critical example of that. So you describe it as systemic change?
Systemic change, yeah. So, change at scale. So instead of you saving 3 kilos of food waste in a small compost thing in your apartment, it's 3 million tonnes right across the entire city because it's accessible and it's easy for people to do. And also there is an end product of value. So that food waste is composted, it's turned into soil conditioner, it's used on the sporting fields around the city, and it's also sold as compost for gardens. So there's actually an income stream from it as well. And it's, a profitable business to run it.
Wow. NBN, eat your heart out. In the midst of all of this change and this consensus building that you're doing at council, you've got right across the political spectrum people that you're having to discuss some quite contentious issues with. How hard is it to respectfully disagree?
I think that is actually the art of politics, and I think that is the most important thing that you can bring. There are lots of times when I have disagreed on the floor of council and disagreed also with people in the community. But being able to do that in a way that is respectful, that is calm, and that is unemotional, I think is the really critical thing here. And I think people do respect you. Constituents do respect you for being honest and also disagreeing, being consistent with your values and saying, meaning what you say and saying what you mean. But also, being open and always going to meet with people, hear them out, hear what they have to say, but at the end say, look, understand that's where you're coming from, but, I think the solution is different or I have a different view. Most people, when you meet face-to-face, are, pretty understanding of that. The exception is social media, which is just a cesspit and is the absolute worst place to try and have political discussions, I think, because it lacks that human empathy that people have in real life. And in my experience, people always bring a certain amount of empathy when you meet with them in real life.
So COVID taught us that we need to spend time together to hear each other out. And one of the reasons that I started this podcast actually is we talk in memes on the internet. We don't engage in discourse. There's no discussion. It's just throwing things in opposite directions and talking past each other.
Yeah. And it's simplistic as well. There's not a great deal of time or attention span for complexity. Things are generally quite simplified. Just back to COVID though, something I really noticed in COVID was the shift in people's mood and the increasing number of people who were angry. And that, I think, personally was a real challenge. And I think it was noticeable across for the staff at council, for councillors, I think for political representatives across the board, I think noticed this phenomenon of people being angrier than usual about things that were less important than usual. And it did make me wonder, what is it about, a community or a population that makes it a generally happy and harmonious community or an angry and fragmented one? And, seeing the change made me realize that there is a difference. There's not just a stasis of, there's always some anger and there's always some happiness, but that actually a community can take on a mood of its own. And how to create communities that are contented, happy and thriving, I think is a really important question and not one that we've really interrogated enough.
So this anger and rudeness, you've said, I think, that rudeness has worn you down and you're actually leaving the council. What do you mean by that? Is this COVID, was COVID the critical juncture, or is it just built over time?
Look, it's always been a feature of politics, absolutely. And I think people look at political leaders and they take their cues from that. So people look at question time and they see people, slinging insults at each other, and they think that that is how you have a political conversation, and they model their behaviour on that. And then I think seeing Trump and the storming of the Capitol and things like that have also provided a blueprint for how people engage in political discourse. And for example, even on Monday evening at council, they had to have additional security there because there was a group of fascists who were threatening to come and stop the rot at council. And so, that is absolutely borrowed from the US, and it's a blueprint that people have seen elsewhere, and they've seen that sort of behaviour and they copy it. And I think if there were more political leaders that were able to debate in a respectful way and to deeply listen, but to also respectfully disagree, it would provide a blueprint for other people to behave in that way. But I can't tell you how different it is to be working in an organisation that doesn't have a public face and that is not political. The way in which people treat you with professionalism and respect is extraordinary after having been in politics for such a long time, where you just come to expect rudeness as the first means of speaking with someone, which I think is a real shame. It doesn't have to be like that. And the people that come politely and, wanting to find solutions are always going to have a better shot at finding a solution. The rudeness is generally tolerated, but nobody wants to spend time with people who are rude and awful. And so, generally you're trying to just sort of get out of that phone call as quickly as you can, whereas somebody who wants to engage respectfully, you're going to go the extra mile to try and help them.
It's almost a failure of leadership, and maybe on both sides, right? Because we go back to Hillary Clinton, Trump, when they go low, we go high. Has it been tried, to have substantive? Is it up to one side to take the lead, and does that work, or do you need both sides to decide? Okay, we're going to have actual discourse, and we're going to model what good discourse looks like and respectful debate looks like.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can, even if there are people out there who are modelling that rude behaviour, doesn't mean you have to do it. And it's something I've really worked hard on, is to never take the bait, never respond to insults, never respond in a personal manner, never insult others, always stick to the debate, try to do it in an unemotional way. And absolutely you can do that without the other side doing it, and it has to start somewhere. In an ideal world, you'd have both sides being committed to do that. But it's not necessary. You know, you can still have rudeness in the world and choose not to engage with that and to remain above it. And I think that's a really important thing to do.
Such a tough question, right? So do you go Jane Fonda and respond in kind, or do you take the higher path, you know, the higher ground, the moral higher ground, and behave differently? My psychologist would have a field day with this, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've really perfected the art of the neutral face in my time there. When people call you girl,
I've perfected the art of the resting bitch face.
Indeed.
So let's drill in a little bit in terms of how the sausage gets made. Tell us about your experience and the disconnect between what people think can be achieved versus what can actually be achieved within politics.
Yeah. That's a great question. And it's, you know, I did this exercise a while back where it was just some team building exercise where everyone had to line up on a line as to how much people thought that politicians were genuinely there for the right reasons and how much thought they were there for self-interest. And I was the person out on the ideological edge saying, I think most people are actually there for the right reasons. And I do actually genuinely think that because politics is really hard. And I think people expect that once you're there, you can perform miracles and that you have all of this power. But there are always different forces at play. There are, you know, negotiations that are needing to be had. That's true for the Prime Minister. It's true for a minister just as much as it is for a humble councillor. And, you know, you can see that there are senior politicians who are there with the absolute best of intentions, who know what needs to be done. But the political reality is that if they go too far, they lose their pre-selection, they lose their seat, or they get booted out of that ministry. And so it's always this careful dance of building political capital and spending it. And, you know, if you overspend the political capital that you have, then you risk losing everything. And so I absolutely have, you know, respect and understanding for those politicians who are there, who want to do more, but, you know, are maybe not able to in this moment. And, you know, there is a really important role for civil society, for others in politics, to try and create the political space for change to happen, because no one has ultimate power in a democracy, and it's all about the conditions around decision makers as much as it is about having people there. That said, not every minister is intelligent and well-intentioned and good at their job, absolutely. And being in a position of power doesn't necessarily mean that you're intelligent and full of integrity. There's absolutely those as well, but it's a really difficult job, and I have a lot of respect for the people that are doing it.
So globally and federally at our level, I feel that there's been a political vacuum at the top level in terms of providing leadership on the climate issue, and that the brunt or the weight of action has actually fallen on cities and councils and small bodies that aren't used to dealing with this sort of thing. So, you know, energy, connecting things to the grid, dealing with consent, dealing with composting, the real hard day-to-day stuff. Has it been hard to work on that in an environment where our federal leadership is basically not leading on the issue? Absolutely.
That is absolutely the case. And like, I cannot tell you the despair that I felt and others felt in the kind of Abbott-Morrison era, where it was just abundantly clear that they were taking the piss. Like, they didn't treat the business of governing seriously. And like, it's one thing to disagree politically with, you know, what their ideology is or what they think, but it's quite another to see people there that are literally behaving like clowns, that don't even take the responsibility of being a minister seriously, are not engaging in any deep level with the way that, you know, policy needs to be made, with a deep understanding of what those decisions mean. I think with the change of government, that has changed, and there is a sense that the government is governing in a grown-up and serious way. That said, Australia's coal emissions and fossil fuel emissions are the highest they have ever been in our history. And so it's one thing to have the rhetoric and to say that this is being taken seriously, but we are absolutely failing. Emissions globally are the highest they've been, and Australia's contribution to that is the highest it's ever been. And so there absolutely needs to be a fundamental shift, or we will be too late in solving this problem, no doubt about it. And you're right, local councils have been at the forefront of it, but have not had the legislative power to do the big and important parts of that need solving.
So I think there's an interesting line here where we're talking about what's possible in politics, what support is given in a legislative context, but also what people are willing to accept in their own communities, which takes us to the topic of the Illawarra offshore wind farm plan, which is currently receiving a lot of pushback from residents, right? So not in my backyard, NIMBYism. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's a big and important issue. Yeah.
Can you give us the lay of the land? What's the project and where is it currently at?
Yeah, so it's a big project. It's a big offshore area. It would be producing about 3.8 megawatts of power, which is enough to power almost all of Sydney. There are similar zones proposed for places like the Hunter off WA, quite a few places around the coast of Australia. We still get most of our electricity from coal. Can you believe it? Like, we have the technology to shift away from fossil fuels, and we are still burning them. And it's, the same as what I was saying, like, the rhetoric is not enough. We actually need to build the infrastructure to make that transition. It won't be built from Lego. It's going to take some time, and these are going to be big projects. So that is currently proposed. Probably nothing will even be built until around, say, 2026, which, looking down the barrel of the climate crisis and seeing houses around me being flooded this weekend, having lived through the bushfires, you think, do we even have the time to wait to 2026 to even start building these things? They're like, if this is urgent, it's urgent. But that is sort of the time frame of where it's at the moment. And yes, as you say, there has been pushback in the community. But, the thing that has been really shocking to me is the amount of deliberate and coordinated misinformation around that. It's not an accident. There is a lot of content that has been flooding social media in Wollongong that has come from the US that is based on lies about wind farms killing whales. It's not true. Ask any expert and they'll tell you that it's not true, but it filters into the consciousness of people. And a couple of weeks ago, there was actually a dead whale washed up on one of the beaches in Wollongong, and there were comments on the Mercury's page saying there'll be so many more of these when the wind farms come. And it's like, this dead whale had nothing to do with wind farms, right? There's not even any wind farms built. How many wind farms are there in Australia offshore at the moment? The answer is 0. There are none. But to see the way that disinformation ecosystem actually changes minds, and it kind of infects this public debate with this stuff that is not true and is not factual, is, I think, something that is really important for us to kind of grapple with, because it's not accidental. There are interests at play here that don't want to see the energy transition, and they have been very effective at kind of infecting this debate with lies.
Fascinating, the whole truth, mistruth, what's real, and how people get activated into conspiracy theories, misinformation. We could talk about it for weeks, I think. So I was having a conversation with my editor before this interview, and she said, I hate the way that wind farms look. Now, I think wind farms are beautiful. I've seen an incredible example of a massive wind farm off the coast of Brighton in England. It's one of the most beautiful seaside towns in the world. It's stunning. But there are people, enlightened people, sustainability-focused people, who don't like the way these things look. And that NIMBYism, right? So not in my backyard, we go back to that phrase. How do you overcome that? Like, what's the motivation that you link people to, or how do you have those conversations with people?
It is a good question. And I think it would be a much more honest debate if it was a debate about how it looks, because, everybody has a right to an aesthetic opinion, right? You can think something is beautiful. I can think it's ugly. Both valid opinions. And if that was what the debate was about, we would at least be coming from the same point of view of what's real and what's not real. compared to this rubbish about dead whales and impacts that are sort of pretend impacts, right? Because the same people that are worried about the whales are not worried about the netting of the beaches, which actually kills whales right here and now. If the worry was marine life, there would be outrage about those sorts of things. That said, I think change is difficult. Change is always difficult, and it's always a darn sight easier to do nothing than it is to do something, because whenever you change something, there will be complaints. For example, we recently widened the cycle path at Bulli, and that meant that we needed to put up a fence because there was sort of a cliff near it that, you know, it was close enough to the path that people could potentially fall off the cliff. So many complaints about the look and the aesthetics of the fence. After it's built, no more complaints. Hundreds of people using the path. They love it. Similarly, another cycleway was going through a sort of a park that has a bit of wild bushland in it. And again, a lot of complaints at the time that it's proposed. People like the gravel. They like the look of the kind of uneven ground. They don't want to see more people using the park. Once it's built, hugely loved piece of infrastructure by the community. You know, dozens of people using it, people that weren't able to use the path before because maybe they had a pram, maybe they were on a bike, maybe they had a wheelchair, whatever. Suddenly it opens that place up as accessible for everybody, and it's hugely loved and hugely popular. It also reminds me of a story that a German friend of mine told. It was one of the first towns in Germany to have a big wind farm built right next to the village. And it was a really similar debate to here in Wollongong, albeit 20 years ago. Hugely divisive. Half of the village were implacably opposed, hated the look of it, didn't want it there, thought it was going to make everyone sick. All of these things that you hear time and time again. They'd spent 10 years of their life fighting this thing. It got built. Now that it's there, people have gotten used to it. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, and suddenly there was a huge angst about energy security, these people were so proud. They were so proud of their wind farm, that they had their own local power generation, that they were one of the first towns to have it. It was part of their identity. It's how they celebrate their city. It's how they talk about it. And I think it shows that the shock of the new is quite difficult. But once you've gotten past that, and once you have it there, people get used to these things. And, you know, the steelworks in Wollongong is ugly. It's undeniably kind of ugly. But it is a part of the city. It's part of the fabric of the city. People are used to it. And it's part of the identity of the place. And I think there is something in change management which is really important in, you know, both acknowledging people's concerns, but also acknowledging that there are, you know, some arguments and some principles that are more important than others. And, you know, an aesthetic consideration, in my mind, is less important than the future of humanity. And, you know, if we have to put up with something that people find is ugly, but the difference is that we can stop burning gas, we can stop burning coal, and we can save the planet, then it's worth it. And, you know, you have to weigh those things up.
So that question of priority is really interesting. Because change, so we have pace, we need to pace this change. And at the same time, people are resistant to change. And the faster the change goes, the faster their sense of control goes, which is, you know, going back to COVID, if we feel out of control, we get angry. Does prioritization help to answer that to some extent, drawing people's attention to what's important?
I think so. And I think having those difficult conversations and saying, yes, we understand that you find it ugly, but, you know, there are these other priorities and these other principles, and that is why we're making a decision. Understand it might not be the decision that you wanted, but there's reasons for it, and these are the reasons. And I think being honest about that and being upfront about that is a really important part of people understanding where you're coming from, even if they don't agree with it.
Mithra, you have a really profound conviction about this. It's it shines through in an incredible way.
There is nothing more important. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a superhero movie trying to save the world, right? And it's like there's all these forces against us. And so every morning you've got to get up and put your silver pants on and try and do this thing before it's too late, because time really is running out. And so, you know, there's always the difficult bit in the movie before they manage to solve it, and I feel like maybe that's where we're at.
Yeah, we're all clutching defeat in the face of potential victory. So on that, you are leaving. Is this climate and this information what's led you to leave?
No, it's not what's led me to leave. I mean, I've been there for 7 years. I think that's a pretty decent stint, actually. And I think there is an art to resigning gracefully and handing on a legacy to somebody new. I really do agree with limited tenure for politicians. I think there's absolutely something to be said for being there for a certain amount of time and not being sort of rusted on. I was never going to be one of those people that's there for 30 years. And, after a certain amount of time, I feel myself being defensive of decisions that we've made. Like when I started, I had a whole lot of ideas, criticisms of how things had been done, ideas of how to do things differently. And the longer you're there, the more you've been a part of that institution for a long time, and you are responsible for the decisions. And then, people criticize, and they've got every right to criticize. And I think, oh yes, but there's reasons. And I actually think having new people with new perspective who are able to take that and say, yeah, you're right, let's change that, is a really important thing to have in any leadership. And I think, any board of a company or, any leadership group needs to have succession plans. It needs to have new energy. It needs to have change, new perspectives. And I think that's actually a really important part of the whole. So it's not just about me personally, though it is as well, because it's not a job you can leave. You can't go traveling. You can't move house. You can't. It's very limiting, and it's career limiting too, because people know they associate you with politics, and there's only a certain type of job that you can do while you're associated with politics. So there's a personal element, but there's also sort of a bigger picture of, my conviction of how politics should work and how it is important to have new ideas, new leadership, and 7 years is long enough, I think.
As you're leaving your role as a councillor, what are some things? So this is a business podcast, and we're talking to business leaders of all stripes, but it's the topic of climatalism, so climate and capitalism. So what are some pieces of advice or suggestions to business, local business, big business, and to consumers or everyday people? One thing for each. What's one thing that you would ask them to take away in thinking about how they're acting to solve the climate crisis that we're in?
Okay, so I think one thing is that every single person only plays a really tiny part in solving the climate crisis. Everyone only has a small contribution. Even when you look at Australia, we only have a small contribution in terms of the globe. I, as an individual, only have a small contribution. And it's easy to think, oh, my contribution is so small, why bother? Australia's contribution is so small, why bother? But actually, that's the case for every single country and every single person. Because, the argument is, well, China. But there's, 2 billion people in China. So the individual contribution of those people is actually very small. And so it does require every single business, every single individual, every single country to take it seriously and do their bit, because otherwise we have absolutely no chance. And everybody does have a little bit of power, and it's worth thinking about, what is my influence in this world? Everybody has some, and everybody has some capacity to make a difference. And it's about thinking, for me, in my position, where do I have influence and how can I use that for good? And we all have it, and we can all use it, and we can all make a difference. And it's actually imperative that we all do.
What an incredible rallying cry. I feel like ready to go up and get up and do something. That's amazing. You're clearly a talented politician. Or you're a leader, I should say. So what does post-politics life look like for you? What are you looking forward to, and where are you going?
What I'm really looking forward to is being able to go for a swim at the pool without being bailed up at the end of the lap with somebody giving me homework. I'm looking forward to the freedom of just being in the community without needing to feel like people can outsource their caring to me, and to find other and different ways to make a difference, of which there are so many. And being a private figure. I'm really looking forward to that. It gets tiring after a while, having to always have a point of view on everything, always tell people where you are, have, a hot take on social media. I am so tired of that part of it, and I'm so looking forward to not needing to do that and just being able to do the things that fire me up and not be seen to be doing things that people want me to be doing. And I think that's going to help me get my energy back for things as well. What is the next? I mean, council is very poorly paid, and so I've been working the whole time anyway. And so I work full time as well as being on council. And so,
wow,
I'm looking forward to my Mondays not being a 16-hour day, to be honest. I work for a communications agency that specialises in climate change. And so I will continue to do that. And so, I am still working on climate change and still looking for ways that my work can turn the dial, make a difference, create the conditions that are needed for that political change and that structural change. But also, as I say, just having the freedom to, play soccer on the weekends and go for a swim and be a private individual. I'm very much looking forward to that.
Mithra, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for everything you've done for Australia and for Wollongong over the last 7 years. What an incredible journey you've had.
Good luck with the podcast, and I hope it goes really well.
Thanks again to Mithra Cox. She speaks with such passion about the Wollongong area and clearly has played an important role in the city's journey towards sustainability. But I also think she shows us that climatalists aren't just big business players sitting at the top of the corporate ladder. They exist in all spaces within the community. Once again, if you like listening today, then please subscribe to The Climatalist wherever you get your podcasts and give us a follow on Instagram where we're just Climatalist. I'm Anton. Thanks for listening.